Thank you once again, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everybody. Once again, I really thank you all to join me in today's session for Cloud PAM on the Rise. And before I talk about the different concerns and different emerging trends, let's first understand what are the different risk of privileges and the financial implications, as well as the intangible impact on an organization. And this is based on a lot of data breach studies which were happening in 2020. So one of the most important fact which came out of this data study was that 52% of the breaches were done with a malicious intent in 2020. And some other startling facts, 19% of these breaches were actually due to cloud misconfigurations and compromised credentials respectively. And another very, very important fact which came out of this study was that the most expensive lost or stolen record was the customer's PII information, which amounted to $150 per record, which was stolen or lost. And it was averaging about 280 days for an organization to identify and contain a breach. The average cost of breach still was amounting to $3.86 million worldwide. And in the United States, it was just the double of this. But all these figures, all these statistics, it boils down to one important aspect, that what is really changing in our landscape, what is really getting changed in our enterprise environments, which is causing these breaches to get more and more sophisticated, as well as organizations struggling to manage the security of their landscape. So let's take a look at what and how this landscape is changing. And I'll start with the infrastructure layer, obviously. The massive push towards cloud transformation, as well as cloud first strategy, is letting organizations to move their workloads on the big three cloud providers, Amazon, Azure, and Google. But the important or the fundamental shift which happened in this was all these infrastructure components are no longer infrastructure entities. They are also now as identities, because you can define roles, you can define permissions to all of these entities, which entails that no longer these components should be perceived as mere infrastructure components, but should be brought under the purview of managing the privileged access, like you do it for identities, as well as do governance for these entities. The second aspect, obviously, on the PaaS layer, there's a lot of investment by customers and enterprises on adoption of containerization, adoption of Kubernetes, Docker. And the challenge here remains the same, that all of these pods, all of these clusters, they are identities, they can have privileged roles, and they also need to be brought under the purview of identity security and privileged identity management. And last but not the least, when you go into the application layer, we all are going through an unprecedented crisis because of the COVID situation. And the push towards remote workplace has seen an exponential growth. And applications have become a big target for any kind of hacks. Recently, there was a big hack on the Zoom application where the credentials were leaked. So applications are moving more and more towards adopting applications, and these applications now have sensitive access to your content, to your data, and thereby having a very focused strategy for application is very imperative. So, so as you can see that all these three layers have gone through a tremendous transformation when it comes to the shift in an organization's landscape. And then the question becomes, how do you manage the privileged access across all these three layers? What's the paradigm shift you need to be thinking about? And what are the different trends which you need to be thinking about? So privileged access management definitely needs disruption. As I said, there's a big focus on shifting to a remote workplace. One of the most important aspect in the disruption is that there's a very fragmented view of security. And often asset owners or privileged access owners, they are required to make informed and intelligent decisions, but they do not have that intelligence. They do not have that view of consolidated security, allowing them to make informed and intelligent decisions. Obviously, with cloud being ephemeral and transient in nature, having that privileged access visibility in a continuous manner itself becomes very challenging. And plus, if you have to realize the full value and potential of privileged access, you have to integrate that with additional tools like IDM or IGA systems, SIM systems as well. And most importantly, a lot of the PAM solutions are very much infrastructure focused. There is not a clear cut, innovative, and creative way to solve the PAM needs for applications, which again is a big need of the hour here. So, with that being said, let's look at what are the trends for our next in PAM solution. And basically, I've summed it up into five different trends, which a lot of our esteemed speakers have also spoken about. Starting with zero trust, moving on to convergence, the need for a converged platform to alleviate the needs of a lot of fragmented view of security. And then moving to integrated governance, because governance have always become an afterthought, always takes a backseat in PAM implementations. Diversification, where I'll be talking about why not just infrastructure, but a big focus on hybrid applications is equally important. And then how do you build a solution on the cloud to meet the needs not only for your cloud, but as well as for your hybrid or on-premise systems as well. So let's start with zero trust. Zero trust is a very broad area, and there are a lot of concepts coming up in zero trust, especially around network segmentation, endpoint security. But for the today's session, I'll focus more on how you can enforce zero trust by a concept of least privileged access, which in turn could be enforced using just in time. You would have all heard about just in time PAM, which in itself is again can be implemented in two different models. One would be a ID or account based, and the second one could be a role based just in time. In an ID and account based, you would also find that there are solutions which do ephemeral access, and then that is where they stop. But the nirvana stage is where you actually go with an ephemeral accounts and access based just in time, which means that in an ideal situation, there are no standing accounts in your target workloads, leaving to a zero exposure on your workloads because there are no accounts to hack onto. And then obviously for role based, this is where the convergence of IDM and PAM comes in play because when you look at a PAM system and if you can understand and ingest the fine grained entitlements of underlying system, that information can be used to create privileged roles in your PAM system, and your users can request for roles to get an in-session privileged elevation rather than requesting for privileged accounts. And just an illustration of this whole model would look something like where a user would be requesting for a privileged access. And at runtime, and here in this case, the user is trying to access or gain privileged access to a Google workload. So at runtime, the Google IAM roles can be crunched, and the conditional access could be sourced from Azure AD or any other system which can do that, and Okta to create or crunch the group membership and combine all of that information to figure out what's the context of this user and what exactly this user really needs access to. And based on that, you get the minimum set of permissions and also create a just-in-time account on the target workload. Next principle is all around convergence. So when you look at convergence, the fundamental goal in convergence is how do you consolidate risk? How do you enforce zero trust and make your PAM processes intelligent? And when you talk about or think about risk, there are four different elements in risk which comes into play. Obviously, the risk associated with your user, the risk associated with the privileged account that user is requesting for, the access on that account, and obviously, and most importantly, the asset to the workload risk. So if I look at an illustration here, in this case, a user is requesting access to an Amazon Linux instance. So if this request comes to me for my approval, what I would start looking at this consolidated risk view is the user's risk score, which is pretty high, and this is coming or sourced from a SIM or a SOAR platform. And then the privileged access and account risk itself is coming in from IDM system, which can tell me what this access really constitute of from an AWS IAM roles or policy standpoint. And lastly, you also would see that the workload or asset risk is being sourced from cloud vulnerability solution or scanning solution, which would tell that whether this workload is having a open port on internet or it has an older version of Java which is not being patched. So all in all, when I have this view, a compendious view of what my overall risk looks like from all these four different dimensions, I can make an informed decision whether I should be granting this privileged access or not, or rather, I would go and talk to the individual owners of these risks to fix those risks first before this user even gets access to it. And obviously, convergence also allows you to stretch and get better returns on investment. So if you look at converging all these technologies together, the key benefits, obviously, you have to you basically get a single platform available to you as a service, which alleviates a lot of integrational challenges and complexities. But most importantly, this whole platform becomes risk driven and easy to integrate in your overall environment and take care of your business drivers and technology drivers as well. Moving on to my next principle is integrated governance. So governance has always become an afterthought. If you look at any PAM implementations, what you would find is that organizations are doing the bare minimum so that they do the MVP or the phase one implementation and think about governance as an afterthought, or do the governance as part of the bare minimum compliance mandates which are required, and look at the intelligence aspect of governance to be something done or dealt with later on. And as organization priority changes, the budgeting and project management requirement changes, that always takes a backseat, which should not be the case, because in the next gen PAM solution, what you can really do is you can tie your HR events, the joiner, mover, leaver events, and invoke or create a least privileged access policy based on these events. And that least privileged access policy itself can be driven through a comprehensive risk evaluation model, which could be either done through an outlier analysis, a business policy analysis. And all in all, it lets your end users or PAM administrators to have a lot of important and intelligent features in your PAM solution. So, for example, your end users can have an intelligent self-service model which allows them or provides them with recommendations based on what their peers have access to, and such users should not or would not even request for something which they are not supposed to. The access certification, which has become a big rubber stamping process in organizations, need not be, because you can completely drive your access certification based on risk. Those could be based on events. For example, if someone changes a job in your organization, what happens to their privileged access? What happens to the succession management? Who owns those privileged service accounts post the user's departure from the organization? So you can really tie in those events into your certification process and do micro certification or just in time certification, thereby making it completely risk driven. And more importantly, with making this risk driven, you also avoid the whole process of doing a bulk access certification, which more or less becomes a rubber stamping in your overall processes. Separation of duties, again, a big ask from a governance standpoint with multiple organizations. And you can have SOD checks, you can have preventive SOD checks for privileged access embedded in your PAM workflows itself. It need not be a separate complex integration with an IDM system to do it together if you have a converged platform of IDM and PAM together. And that allows you to have intelligent governance already included in your environment. As I was explaining earlier, the next principle is or trend is diversification. Infrastructure focused solutions, they cannot work with applications. The inherent security model of applications is very different from infrastructure. So thereby doing the traditional way of solving the PAM needs of applications do not work. And as I was mentioning earlier, that the digital transformation and the push towards remote work have made applications a big target for any kind of breaches and data leaks. And typically, organizations, the way they have solved for is you have a separate dash admin accounts for users who need privileged access to your application. Do not go with that. Let not be that your de facto model when you're thinking about doing PAM for applications. Firstly, it avoids your licensing cost, especially if you're dealing with SaaS applications. And secondly, it reduces a lot of your exposure because of you having standing accounts withstanding privileged access in your application. Rather, what you can think about doing that is implementing a role-based PAM. What I mean by role-based PAM is that your PAM platform can integrate with applications, suck in or ingest in. For example, if I take Salesforce, the fine-grained permission sets, the profiles information, or the fine-grained entitlements from these applications, you do take ingest all of that, massage all that data, and create privileged roles. And thereby, you do not have to create separate accounts, but users can request for roles, privileged roles, when they have to elevate their access onto applications. And this could be an inline session elevation. Users don't even have to do or maintain separate sessions for that. So all in all, with implementing a role-based PAM or implementing or avoiding the IDs proliferation allows you to have less identity lifecycle management overheads for your privileged accounts, as well as it helps you in your overall compliance audits, which alleviates some of these concerns because of these additional accounts which you have in your environment. Lastly, the biggest trend here is that as the focus shift towards cloud, you also have to think about a PAM solution which meets the next gen solution or needs for a cloud environment. Identifying all these possible interfaces, it is very, very important you to have or strategize your PAM solution. And the solution needs to be built on cloud to solve the need for cloud and hybrid application. Just to give you an example here, the nuances around managing privileged access for your management consoles of AWS Azure is very different from how you do the management or privileged access management for serverless technologies. A serverless code is very different from a traditional .NET or a Java code because it runs from east to west, unlike a traditional code which runs from north to south direction. What it really means is that you have to think about how do you eliminate the threat vectors when it comes to solving the needs for serverless function. Cloud databases, they don't even have APIs. So how do you manage the lifecycle of your privileged identities in cloud databases? APIs again play a very important role. We live in a world of API, but the damage when your API keys get checked into a public code repository is humongous, and it's so expensive to determine the extent of that leak. DevOps tools, again, they play a special, or they have a special mention here because DevOps teams, they think that implementing these kind of security or privileged access management tools reduce the agility, reduce the, or create a barrier, and which is against the principle of DevOps. And it need not be. You can have PAM for DevOps in a very effective and agile manner. And that's what is important for you to have a consolidated strategy to secure all the different conduits and interfaces through which your users can gain privileged access to your underlying ecosystem. So if I have to sum it up, how do you disrupt PAM and how do you go away from a traditional design pattern is create a solution which doesn't rely on a traditional jump box based model because it often becomes a choking point in your architecture and it is not scalable enough to handle the velocity of a cloud-based environment specifically. Move away from thick clients. Thick SSH and RDP clients often comes up with their own set of operational overheads. You have to think about patching, rolling them out. No need for you to invest in a separate IGA or an IDM system. You can look at solutions which consolidate these technologies in a single platform. And obviously move away from a model which relies completely on persistent accounts. Rather, think of solutions which are just in time. You always model towards zero standing privileges and zero standing accounts. And most importantly, your PAM processes needs to be risk aware. The reason being is that risk is the fundamental parameter which drives your whole PAM strategy, and governance should never become an afterthought. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you once again for joining me in today's session. If you have any other questions, I would definitely be in the speakers lounge and would glad to take up your questions as well.